Hey Nerdy Knitter, Tanya here. I'm a certified knitting instructor and a master hand knitter, and the goal here at Nerdy Knitting is to help you become a more confident, adventurous knitter. And I thought this month I would love to talk about what happens when you want to knit a pattern, but you can't get the recommended gauge. Should you try to? Are there ways to adjust? I'm going to talk about the process that I went through to knit this garment, the Westbound by Elizabeth Doherty. So this top has been on my to knit list for a while. It's a very simple style. It's just plain stockinette, but I really loved the finishing details. It has just a really nice finished neckline, the sleeve opening, this little slip stitch that runs right down the center front and the back and the sides, the I-cord edging at the bottom, and just really nice little details that I really appreciated. And I wanted something simple to knit, but with those nice finishing details. And even this pretty lateral braid that runs across the back right along there. I really liked that touch as well. So I was really curious to see how all of that was constructed. It's knit from the top down. You start on that back neck. You cast on all the stitches you need for the width of the shoulders and the back neck. And you start knitting the back first with some short row shaping, and then you work the fronts as well. They're worked individually because you're working your front neckline shaping at the same time. And during that process, you also have this little lateral braid going on. So once all of that part is done, you join at the underarms and you start knitting the body. The rest of it is really pretty smooth sailing after that once you get all of the top part finished. And in most sweater constructions, that's where you spend a lot of those details, looking at the shoulder shaping and the neckline and all of that. And I loved all that. It was a great process, but I ran into a problem right away, and that was with my gauge. So the original yarn recommended in this pattern was Shibui Knits Reed Held Double. I knew I wasn't going to use that yarn, but I figured I could be fine with a suitable sort of any plant fiber, you know, that I can mix and match a little bit. There's going to be not seams, but I mean, the way it's constructed, you are sort of creating shoulder seams. So there is some stability for the garment. So I thought it would be all right to just replace it with another plant fiber. So I looked at the gauge information, and it falls within sort of a DK weight range. And I decided I would just find a DK weight yarn, a plant fiber that I wanted to use for a summer garment. So I was going to knit picks for some other yarn anyway, so I looked there and I decided to try the CotLin yarn. Now I've never used this for a garment before. I've swatched with it for some other things, but haven't actually knit a sweater or a garment with it. But it had the same gauge as the one in the pattern, so I thought, okay, this should be fine. So I ordered the yarn, and when it arrived, I did my swatch. And in this case, I did a pretty big swatch. I started on the recommended needle size, and I just kept going up from there to see which fabric I liked and which one would match the gauge of the pattern. Now, on even the smallest size, a US 4, I still wasn't meeting the recommended pattern gauge. And I honestly thought that fabric, I wouldn't want to go down any smaller because that fabric was pretty firm. It's not bad, but it wasn't what I wanted. I wanted something more loose and drapey. I wanted a tunic length top that I could wear with leggings and would sort of move and have some good drape and not be too stiff. So that was my first problem. I wasn't meeting pattern gauge even on my smallest needle size. I'd have to go down even smaller, and I didn't like the fabric. I really preferred, I think it was this one right here on the US 6. So my gauge was completely different than the designer's. But I liked my fabric. So from there, I had to decide, was it worth using my gauge, knowing that I would have to probably test things, maybe rip things out and redo. And for me, it was worth it. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes you just want a simple knit and not have to think about stuff like that. But in this case, I liked that fabric on that US 6. So I took some careful measurements to make sure I understood what my gauge was. And I used that information to decide what size to cast on. Now the big issue here is you cannot use the schematics in a pattern like that to see what size you're going to get for each part. You have to figure that all out on your own. So what I did is I measured the widest part across that swatch that I could get to make sure I could get a good sized section to check my gauge. And then I used that to figure out my 1-inch stitch gauge. Then I decided how wide around, or the circumference I wanted at the bust for my sweater. I wanted to have a lot of positive ease in places, but I wanted it to fit very well in the top. I didn't want it to fall off my shoulders. So I decided to go with like a pretty close fit just at the bust, knowing that everywhere else it would be a little bit looser. So I took my 1-inch stitch gauge, multiplied that by that circumference that I wanted at the fullest point of the bust, and that gave me a stitch count that I should look for. So then I went to the pattern, and I didn't look at the cast on number because that was just going to be like the length of the shoulders from here all the way over to here. It wasn't going to be the full circumference. So you read through your pattern if you're going to do something like this until you find that point where you've joined things in the round. And there is some shaping later on, but I wanted to see what the stitch count at the bust was going to be. So when things are joined and things are starting to be worked in that area, found that part in the pattern, and I chose the size that was closest to the stitch count that I was looking for, which happened to be a size 6 in my case. And I would follow the instructions for the 6th size because that was the closest to the stitch count that I wanted to use. It had nothing to do with the pattern schematics. I couldn't look at the 6th size in the schematic to see what the measurements were going to be because my measurements were completely different. But I could use it as a starting point. So I cast on following the 6th size. I'm having a hard time saying that one, I think. And you cast on at the top, you sort of cast on from one shoulder to the other, right across the back right here where that lateral braid is. And you start working short rows, shaping the back down to the armhole. I mean, you don't work short rows the whole way, you just continue them until the shoulders are shaped, and then you knit down. Then you repeat for the front. You stop and you work that lateral braid, which I really love. It just really finishes it off nicely along the back neck. And then you work each of the fronts with that shoulder shaping as well, and your V-neck shaping. And there's these lovely little slip stitch details going on, and along the neck and along the sleeves where you slip the 3rd stitch. So the first 2 stitches you're knitting, and then on one round or one row you knit that 3rd stitch, but then on the 2nd row, following row, you're slipping that stitch. So you get this little nicely finished edge, and those other 2 stitches that were just knit and purled, because they're worked in stockinette, they roll to the inside. So there's no finishing detail on this neckline. It just simply rolls to the inside, just a lovely little detail that I really like, and very simple finishing, no picking up stitches to knit a neckline. Same thing with the sleeves. Now you do have the option to add sleeves, and I did add one just to test it out and didn't really like it, so I took that back out. But then once everything here is shaped, you join and you're working the front after your neckline is finished. So you work each side separately to the V-neck point, and then you join and you finish until things are the depth that you want. And of course my stitch gauge was off compared to the pattern, and my row gauge was off as well, which isn't such a big deal most of the time. You just have to work to your row gauge, and that's what I did. When it was long enough for me, I joined it at the underarms, and you bind off some stitches and join things. So you get sort of like this dolman shaping under the arm. And then I was at that full circumference. So I tried it on at a few different points. I tried it on to check the armhole depth before joining to make sure it was going to be long enough. And then when it was, I joined everything in the round, and I did whatever you have to do for the underarm shaping. Then I tried it on again to check to see how the fit was once everything was joined, because that was the real test to make sure that this was going to fit the way I wanted it to. And it did, thank goodness. Like, I like the way it drapes. I like where the sleeves fall. The drop shoulder gives it sort of a cap sleeve or a long sleeve on me. Well, short sleeve, but it gives me enough sleeve length that I really like that. But it still fits well through the shoulders and the bust. It's not falling off anywhere, which is sometimes an issue when you have a larger bust or a larger body. You think you have to knit the whole thing bigger, but then it's way too big in the shoulders and the neckline and it's falling off. You really want it to fit well. And then you can sort of increase the sizing for the rest of your body. But your frame, your shoulders, and this part of your body doesn't really change size too much. The rest of you might vary in size, but that part of your body, it's going to stay pretty much the same. And you want things to fit well. So once I tried it on, everything fit well. But the second thing that I noticed, I had run into another problem. When I stood sideways, I noticed that the back had a nice straight horizontal line, but the front of my garment was like pointed up, whatever degree that is, I don't know. Instead of having a nice straight horizontal line all the way around, which is what you're aiming for, if you don't have that and you notice things are riding up in the front, you're going to see that in your finished sweater as well. If you've ever worn a t-shirt or a sweater and you have a larger bust or a stomach and you notice that the front hem sits higher than the back hem, or it's riding up as we would say, then that is going to be an issue as you're knitting. And thankfully I noticed it when I was trying it on at that point, so I could address it right away. And I addressed it by deciding to work some short row shaping. Now there's a few different ways to add bust shaping. One of them is to do like some vertical darts, like you would see like in a blouse or a button-up blouse, where you can see like this the seam lines along the front where you take in some of the waist and you allow for more space in the bust and the hips. The same kind of idea. You can do that with your knitted garments as well. That's one way to work dart shaping. Another way is to work some short rows to add extra fabric across the width, which is what I decided I needed to do in this case. If you're trying to decide which one to go with, I think the vertical ones work well if you're doing like a very form-fitting top and you want to just add some extra shaping right in the bust area, then that works well. But if you have quite a large area that you sort of need to fill in, and when I tried this on, that's what I noticed, that I really had quite a big difference. When you stand sideways, if you're trying something on top down, you can see a big difference between where the back line is and where the front line is on that garment. You got to fill in that space more or less. And the horizontal bust darts fill that in pretty much. So at this point, I just had to knit a little bit more. You want to get down from the underarm, probably about 2 inches or so, and then you stop and you work those bust darts. And there is a little bit of math involved here, but they're easy to add to any garment. I don't have to add them to every single garment, but when things are more fitted in the bust, that's usually when I have to pay attention and add them in, like in the case of this garment. Now, I knew I wanted to add bust darts, but there were a few things I wanted to check first. First of all, I put everything on waste yarn and I washed it, just like I was going to wash my final sweater. I wanted it to be sort of fitting and sitting the way it was going to be when it was done. That's really important when you're checking for a fit issue like this. The next thing is this is when I also added the sleeves. Well, I added one, decided I didn't want them, so I took it back out. But if I were going to add sleeves, I would do them at this point because that can affect the way the top fits. And you want to make sure everything is fitting the way it's supposed to before you measure for your bust darts. So at that time I had done my gauge, my sleeves were finished, so I could wash and block, make sure everything was ready, and then I tried it on and did my measurements. Now we could spend this whole time just discussing how to do bust dart shaping, but I'm not going to do that because I feel like that topic deserves a whole video just on its own. Perhaps we'll do that in the future, but I will I'll put some links to some resources down below to help you explore this topic if it's something that you want to explore. So once you have your calculations, you figure out where those bust darts are going to be placed, and you place them on the sides. You don't want them like right in the front. Your short rows are going to be on either side of the fullest point of your bust. So you're adding extra fabric back and forth across here without working across the back of your sweater. You're just working back and forth in short rows from this side to this side. So you can see as you're working back and forth, you get that short row shaping along the side of your garment. So when you're done with your bust darts, this is a good time to wash and block again and try things on again. And at this point, if they've been done correctly, you should have a pretty straight horizontal line all the way around your garment. That front shouldn't be riding up anymore. And that was the case when I tried it on here. So once that's done, it was pretty much smooth sailing from there. I just had to work some shaping because it's an A-line garment, and this is where I decided to add even more shaping. So I went from the 6th size to the 7th size in stitch count. You're sort of adding this A-line extra fabric around the hips and butt in that area. And I wanted a longer garment, so I had more space to work with those. But I also had to check the numbers compared to my row gauge so I could adjust that shaping rate. So there is a lot of math involved when your gauge is a very different thing. But other than that, it was very simple knit, just plain stockinette, some of those slipped stitches, everything in the top was all finished, so it was just a matter of knitting the length that I wanted, doing some short row shaping for the shirt tail hem, and then finishing off with an I-cord edge. So here's a look at the finished sweater, and this is what you can do even if your gauge doesn't match the designer's gauge. But it does come with a lot of extra work and math and some ripping out and redoing as well. It's definitely possible to follow a pattern without having the recommended gauge and having your own gauge. As you can see, I did that with this top, but you definitely have to be at least a little bit adventurous and willing to rip things out and try again. If you've ever done anything like this, I would love to hear about your experience, so please leave me a comment and tell me about how that process went for you and any tips or advice that you would share. Perhaps we can discuss this again in the future. And if you want to keep hanging out with me, here's another video where I talk about some different sweaters, including this one that I've knit for my favorite summer tops, the modifications I made, the yarn I used, and all of the details. So click right there and I'll see you in the next video.